Hello, everyone. This is Derek Taylor for HIST 126. And this is a lecture for you guys on the text for this week, Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon. So I'm calling this the Totalitarian Age, Arthur Koestler and Stalinism. And if you don't know, I'll go over the book in a second. It's a sort of fictionalization of events that actually happened in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. And that's to do with the rise of this. This is going to spend the last two books of the course talking about. And this week, Soviet Union and Stalinism, and the week after, the Nazis and the Holocaust. So we get started with this lecture, and won't make it too long for you guys. I'll give you some background for the novel itself. And just a brief overview of what's going on in Western society, European society mostly during the interwar period, and how World War I just reshaped the world. Why this is doing this? Okay, I didn't mean to do that. The first thing that happens, and we've already talked about this last time, is that you had the collapse of all these empires because of World War I. Ottoman, the Russian, the Austro-Hungarian empires all collapse. And then the emergence of new states. Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Poland were created out of the chaos of World War I. The Soviet Union will emerge as the first communist state. And America will emerge as a great power, really, for the first time. American people are reluctant to play that role, but they play a role, and they will play one going forward, obviously, in this course. So in that new order, again, before World War I, it looks something like this. Russian Empire over here, and you see the Nordic countries, France, Spain, Portugal, Austria-Hungarian Empire, Serbia, Bulgaria. You see the stuff before the war, the German Empire. Down here, some stuff we won't see next time, but the Ottoman Empire. And then by the end of it, of course, it's been reshaped by the war. Germany is left sort of cut up. Poland's brought back. Latvia and Lithuania are given their independence. Romania, Hungary, all these states get their independence. Yugoslavia. And Turkey becomes a republic. The Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Caliphate comes to an end as well. So you have those alignments changing after World War I. And the first thing, I don't know why I was doing that. The first thing about this, just about the Western democracies, in the 1920s, you'll have the Labor Party will emerge. It already is. It's born in 1916, but you have the first labor governments, again, socialist, officially socialist governments. Getting into office, the first prime minister is Ramsay MacDonald in 1924. He's not the head of a labor government per se, but the head of a coalition. But the first labor government is elected in 1929, around the time of the Great Depression begins. So you have, socialism coming to the fore, and working men's parties, in this period with the collapse of these, all these empires and everything. In these places, you'll have France's new working class. It's an industrial nation by this time, coming to the fore. There are socialist parties in France, and then by the 1930s, you have the construction of what's called a popular front. The name comes from Spain, but it's a popular front of various leftist parties, communist parties, socialist parties. I'll explain the difference in a moment for the names, who come together to oppose the right, the fascist right, in the 1930s. But they'll come to fruition in the 1920s. And of course, you have in Weimar Germany, a liberal republic being formed after World War I, the Kaiser overthrown. And there is and so you have this republic whose capital is in Weimar. And Weimar is this cultural capital. And so you have that, you have essentially people looking back in Germany, I guess, as an antidote to all the militarism that led to the war in the first place. Looking back to that sort of, tradition of Goethe and the more, poetic, romantic vision of what Germany can become. We'll get to this next time, but it's also kind of a decadent republic anyway. That's the trend there. And then you also have in the United States the Roaring Twenties, when the Republicans basically the White House. But the United States becomes this really grand world power for the first time. And things are booming in the 1920s, although not for everybody. So growth of American power is very important. And again, the reemergence of working parties and socialist parties especially makes people nervous. Why? Because of the Russian Revolution. There are also several changes across Western society that will be very important. The first one is you're going to have population increases in Europe after the war, and the United States, I should mention as well. You're going to have massive refugee exchanges across borders after 1920. You're going to have, you're going to have just a different, distribution of population. Only 1/3 of France's population, for example, is living in rural areas by 1931. The new urban population is mostly is an urbanized population in Europe, is not working in industry, which hardly grows after 1900. So we'll talk about this in a moment. You're going to have a white collar class grow up in Europe across this period. You're also going to have, of course, technological innovations that make society more mobile, less settled, motor car, automobile, whatever you want to call it, those sorts of things that give it a less settled feel would have happened anyway, probably at the same time. Plain radio and television, right? Things that are changing the nature of this society. As already mentioned, many countries are becoming urban by the 1920s. The United States is a majority urban country by the 1920s for the first time. And particularly in Europe, a new middle class is emerging, which is more white collar, as I mentioned before. It's made up of people in the service industries. So again, the beginning of what's going to happen in the 60s and 70s everywhere is the beginnings of a service class, and a service economy grows up. Civil service in government, sales workers, stockbrokers, office personnel, yada, yada, the drill. But also government bureaucracy. These governments are getting bigger and bigger. So, of course, it happened in the United States during the Great Depression with the New Deal. But by 1930, something about 20% of the workforce in Britain works for the national government. 18% of the workforce in Germany. So you're having this just sort of this shearing off of society, not only, by the way, just in terms of numbers, but also because managerial class is what you'd call that first thing, which you have middle class norms becoming more prevalent. That is to say, again, Europe was still an aristocratic society before World War I. They still had, social mores were still in some way set by that. The two world wars, and it's not just this one, but the second one as well, basically obliterate all of that. And so as a result, you're going to have, and by the way, there are still some noble families left in Europe. They're still around. You can find them, by the way, on Twitter. There are Habsburgs, for example, who still have Twitter. They're still around. The Bourbon family is still around. They're still there, but they basically become service. They basically become work for the state as in that regard. Something happens in Britain. So middle class norms are just now totally dominant and hegemonic in a way they haven't been before. So this is a change for European society. You also have, of course, society becoming more level because the role of women will change as a result of the war. The entry into the workforce of women during the war will blur gender divisions in most countries. It will also lead to them getting the right to vote in large numbers. And there'll be changes, by the way. At the elite level, there already have been. There's already, feminism's been a thing for 100 years, basically, or 100, but close to 100 years in Western life. And among the intelligentsia, there's some of that there. Among most women across the Western world, traditional ideas are about gender are pretty widespread till the 1960s. But the seeds of that are there, and they're given a push among the elites, among the intelligentsia. Lots of traditional things are called into question by World War I. It seems to have wiped out. It seems to have been like Europe's suicide for a lot of people. They use those types of terms to refer to it. So this leveling effect of the war is very prevalent everywhere. This is a map, by the way, just showing you the decade when women attained the right to vote. And you can't see it because it's cut off by the map. The first place where women got the right to vote actually at national level was actually New Zealand in 1893, right down here. The second one, as I see in Australia in 1902, and then the Nordic countries in the early part of the century. But other than that, basically every other country is a result of the post-war, in Europe anyway. Doesn't come until after World War I. There's a direct cause and effect, actually. It's one of the causes of women obtaining the right to vote. And so the leveling effects of society, in some ways, most notable there. You also have a more sexual society. Sexual mores become relaxed among elites. So the elites, again, I mentioned Weimar Germany, especially there are campaigns. I don't think they were wholly successful to legalize abortion. I believe there was also campaigns to legalize contraceptives. In 1930, a major milestone. Up until 1930, every Christian body in the world had seen artificial contraception as being immoral. This goes back to the earliest days of Christianity. And the Church of England, 1930, changes its position only for married couples. Within 30 years, they basically ran it for everybody. But that's a milestone, which has to definitely be a result of the war. And all this, by the way, is related to urbanization as well, in terms of growing numbers of people living in cities. Again, big city. There's this oversight of parents and stuff like this. This is obvious stuff, but just to reiterate, it's a big, mass population, right? You can get away with more stuff. People do. I also should mention this, and I mentioned this partly because we used to read Freud in here in this sort of slot where I've got Darkness at Noon. We used to read some of Freud's work. It is important that his ideas don't really gain widespread acceptance among, again, the intelligentsia until after World War I. They give Freud's theories plausibility. You read novels from that period, Freudian slip, all that stuff. It's all over the place. Freudian ideas, not always, by the way. If you get that, if you get Freud from these novels, you get a pretty dumbed down version of it. I don't agree with Freud about pretty much most things, but he's a more serious thinker than some of the popularizations of his work make him seem. But the war gives these things, again, plausibility. Why? Because, what you got in Eric Maria Remarque's book, if the culture of 1,000 years couldn't prevent all this, what good is it? That touches everything, including sexual mores. And you can kind of see this again reflected in art and, things like this. Josephine Baker, the African-American lady who goes to Paris, becomes a famous dancer, entertainer. Marlene Dietrich, the Blue Angels, again, another Weimar Republic film, highly sexualized, great movie star, but again, related to that urbanization as well of the time period. Another thing that does this as well is in this period is the ability of consumer society to change things. Again, it's hard for us to appreciate this because we live with this. But cheap, mass-produced clothing sold in stores made for a blurring of social differences, made it easier to imitate the upper classes. This isn't immediately obvious, by the way. I had, in America, even at that time, I had my master's thesis advisor told me that when his mother went to college in the 1920s, she could walk into a classroom and tell you what class people came from just by the clothes they wore. But by the time you get to the post-war period, the 1960s, of course, you can't tell by the clothes that people wear because everybody wears the same clothes now. There's a blurring of those sorts of things by this as well. And I've already kind of mentioned this. I reiterate it here. Aristocracy is gone or reduced for the most part. I have another thing up here, I think. Yes, urbanization also levels society. Things I've already said. And it's worth repeating anyway. Sometimes you have extraneous things on your slides. Anyway, but the leveling of society can't be undone because, again, the World War I's sort of I'll say a wake-up call, but it's a coming to realization that modern society has really changed things in ways that people are frightened of. And there's a sense of wanting to control all these massive changes to impose some order on all this chaos. And this is leading into, Stalinism and things of that nature. So, but definitely all these things play into the interwar period and the interwar mood when these things are in play. Also briefly want to talk about culture between the wars. Maybe that should be number 2 and it should be number 2, not number 3. I guess my numbers are off here. I'll change it on the slides when I put it up there for you. But culture between the wars, because culture reflects this high and low. There is greater leisure time, which has already happened in the late 19th century, but it bursts in between the wars and becomes an international phenomenon. This is partly because of technology, because, radio now, after the war, has an immediate global impact. Virtually every country in Europe, United States, you create these, in the United States, we don't have a government-funded radio broadcast. RCA is formed in 1920. RCA will actually become a major provider of radio transmission to Latin America. Every, BBC, every country in Europe, BBC, France, the places will have radio stations. Same time, 1920. So this is the golden age of radio. So this makes, communication across borders more easy. You also, of course, have the rise of the film industry, what sometimes will come to be called the church of the masses, right? Because people will come to these darkened theaters and they'll sit there quietly. They used to, I guess, at some point. And they have their roots in sort of turn of the century Nickelodeons in the United States. And this has become an industry in 1910 in Southern California in the United States. And so because of World War I, there were budding industries in all these countries. Hollywood becomes the movie capital of the world, producing about 90% of all films for this. And so, and by 1925, American films will make up 95% of the movies screened in Britain, 80% of those screened in Latin America, and 70% of those in France as well. And certainly, by the way, they're dominant. And people know this. This is part of the thing. This is part of why, by the way, one of the things that unsettles people in Europe after the war, because their societies have been sort of unsettled by the war, especially Britain and France. And then all of a sudden comes this tidal wave of popular culture from the United States, which is now, by the way, I didn't mention this, it's now begins its era as which still continues, the dominant financial power in the world. It overtakes Britain. World War I begins the draining of Britain and the inevitable end of its empire, because it just can't sustain it because of this. So the financial capital of the world shifts from London to New York, and causes a lot of hand wringing among people intellectuals in places like Britain. They don't. You have this very egalitarian culture flooding their civilization. They don't like it in a lot of ways, but films are sort of the beachhead in some regards. You also have this sort of cult of celebrity growing up, in which you have actors. Being treated, actors, by the way, traditionally are treated like trash, have been in most societies. But now, that, of course, because of the rise of modern media and films, they are now, international celebrities. People will follow them in the news like they used to follow monarchs. I still kind of do follow monarchs, by the way. But even people like, most spectacularly, Charles Lindbergh, the pilot who makes the first transatlantic flight, he becomes a household name overnight. Flies across the Atlantic. When he comes, to Britain, to Paris, when he lands there, I mean, he's literally like worshipped. There are women screaming and throwing themselves at him at these crowds. It's like the Beatles in the 1960s or something. People fighting over relics of his hair as memorabilia and things of this nature. And so, one Frenchman described him as a new Christ. And again, the search for some sort of meaning and some sort of savior after this civilizational catastrophe is partly a part of this rationale for this, and it kind of comes from this new tidal wave of culture and everything. And again, I mentioned figures. Charlie Chaplin, by the way, is the biggest actor in the world. He hangs around with people like Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill, by the way, is a born aristocrat. He's the son. Comes from the line of the Dukes of Marlborough. But he's buddy with this movie star, even though he complains about his Bolshevik politics. So all this stuff is a new thing in the 1930s. And then sports is a mass phenomenon. It's already been a mass phenomenon, but it becomes a global sort of thing for a variety of reasons. There are all these, mass entertainments that become even more important in the interwar period for a lot of reasons, as we'll see. And so all these things are part of this, acceleration of the massification of society. And there's Charlie Chaplin there, a picture of him, Jackie Coogan from one of his early films, the great silent film star. This is Lindbergh, and I believe this is Paris, 1927. You can kind of see what kind of, when I say it's a cult, it is kind of a cult. He becomes one of the most famous people in the world overnight. And this sort of, again, mobbing a celebrity is a product of 20th century media, obviously, which begins in the interwar period. And then finally, you have, things like I mentioned, mass phenomena, internationalization of it. The first World Cup is played in 1930. I think this is going on now. I don't like soccer at all. Sorry, I don't care about it one bit. I think there is. I don't know. I'm not paying attention, but starts in 1930 in the interwar period. So all part of this growing phenomena of this unsettling of civilization. And there's a reaction against this. Intellectuals I've already mentioned across Western Europe, especially, are worried about the future of Western civilization, about the future of democracy, about the viability of democracy. Can you really trust people who their main pastime in life is going to soccer matches and getting drunk and getting into fistfights, those sorts of things? In particular, they're worried that the masses are overwhelming civilization, a socially undifferentiated, culturally generic block of people, devoid of what they consider civilization, devoid of individuality, devoid of taste, culture, et cetera, et cetera. You have people like Oswald Spengler in 1919, who believed that liberalism led to democracy, which would lead to Caesarism at one point. Instead of 1919, he publishes his massive multi-volume work, Decline of the West, which he publishes in 1919, which is his idea of the inevitable collapse of civilization. So this is the kind of a natural thing to think after World War One. Others, maybe a little more important, by 1930, a man named Jose Ortega y Gasset, a Spanish author, which basically he was an elitist who, again, he thought this is the classic definition. He thought the masses were just undifferentiated, again, sort of mindless mass of people who wanted by sheer force to impose its ideas and everything. There's worried that there's this massive force was going to wipe out people's individuality or something. And the masses want to rule, but are incapable of reasoning, and therefore he rejected it all. He rejects this stuff rejected in all forms. And he is thinking, by the way, by 1930, of fascism and its contempt for reason. You can see similar, again, see this elsewhere, but lots of thinkers will have, a temptation, a flirtation with non-liberal forms of government. They look at modern liberal society, it must be failing. Lots of people flirt with this stuff. George Bernard Shaw was an admirer of Lenin and Mussolini. People like H.G. Wells wanted a class of governing experts or technocrats to rule the world. People, especially among artists, D.H. Lawrence, the novelist, thought that democracy was a spent force. He thought it needed a Caesar to come replace democracy. Evelyn Waugh was someone who admired Mussolini to a certain degree. He's a great novelist in the 1920s and 30s. Also, Franco. Ezra Pound, the poet, later on would go and work for Mussolini in Italy and write speeches for him. Someone like T.S. Eliot, a great poet, modernist poet, had sort of right-wing affinities. He was never an admirer of Hitler or anything, but he had them. Other people are attracted to the USSR. Lots of intellectuals, lots of writers like Theodore Dreiser, lots of intellectuals. And the reason why, you're wondering why, right? Why are people attracted to these what seem in retrospect extreme ideas? They think the modern West is dying. They think the experiment with democracy was a mistake. They think capitalism, right? It caused in some ways, this war. And of course, you get to the Great Depression. It makes fascism and totalitarianism and communism seem like the future to a lot of people. And in particular, intellectuals. The last note about this, the historian of communism, Soviet communism, Robert Conquest, particularly with regards to Stalin, said that Stalin in the 1930s seemed to people to be like the embodiment of the big idea. And intellectuals were looking for a big idea to save mankind or save the West. And that's why they get attracted to these dictators and some of these people, because they think the world is so chaotic, we need to impose order on it in this regard. This happens in other areas. I won't go into this too much detail, but there's a revolt, of course, against reason in philosophy. There's an emphasis on the irrational in philosophical circles. Things like the philosophy is called vitalism. This is people like the French philosopher Henri Bergson argued that immediate experience and intuition were more important for understanding reality than rational thinking. You have in the English-speaking world thinkers like, for example, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who reduces philosophy to the study of language, arguing that and it could be tested by scientific experiments or demonstrated by logic and mathematics were useless. So there's this there's this sort of revolt against all this stuff. There's also, of course, a revolt against, in certain aspects of reason, even in physics, even in the sciences. Again, the discoveries of people like Marie Curie and Max Planck that show that matter and energy might be two different forms of the same thing. This shows that maybe the building blocks of the universe might be atoms weren't necessarily stable things, right? And of course, you get Einstein with his theory of relativity. Later on, Ernest Rutherford, who showed the atom could split, and so atomic energy becomes a thing. Most famously, of course, Werner Heisenberg hypothesized that it's impossible to know precisely the position and speed of an individual electron, therefore to predict its behavior. And so, at the molecular level, the world seems not to run on the same neat set of classical mechanical laws. I'm thinking classical physics like Newton. And so there is this idea that physics no longer provides this comforting answers about the stability of the laws of nature or man's place in things. You also have, even by then, you have a brief flirtation among certain, you'll get writers like C.S. Lewis and people like that. I had to mention T.S. Eliot, I'm mentioning people like that. There's certain of them who will turn against modernity, always look back to Christianity as an antidote to the sort of breakdown of civilization this way. Christianity is not anti-rational. I probably shouldn't have said that, but I lump it in there. There's this turn toward the non-rational, definitely. And again, this goes along with Freud, Jung in the 1930s. So all these things are kind of in the air. Oh, I forgot to mention Martin Heidegger's Being in Time. I forgot to have other things up there. Being in Time, if you don't know, is his great work, which posits that human beings were historical creatures thrown into the world, and their quest for authentic existence couldn't be, divorced from that time-bound world. So you have this reflection of this. Oh yeah, I already mentioned Heisenberg and Einstein. So Heisenberg famously, instability, Walter White and Breaking Bad, those sorts of things. I should not have been so cute with my slides here. Anyway, but you have this reaction against a liberal bourgeois order reflected in the art of the period as well. There is this move to abandon tradition, move to abandon the considered to be the rules of art, traditional rules of art. And this had begun, by the way, before the war. Modernism begins before the war. The war just births it as a massive phenomenon in many ways, but it's motivated by a lot of disillusionment, as you can imagine. It's elitist and it's difficult on purpose. It's meant to reject the conventions of a decadent liberal bourgeois society and a materialist civilization. And there's this idea again that tradition of any kind and anything with this tradition needs to be rejected. One of the most famous, not even statements of outright rejection, but a breakdown of this is, of course, T.S. Eliot's poem "The Wasteland," published in 1922. Also a personal statement. He had gone through a nervous breakdown before he wrote this, and so it's this breaking down of Western civilization becomes a classic of modernist literature. You have people like D.H. Lawrence and Thomas Mann, the German novelist, turning toward the subjective, turning toward sex as a sort of alternative source of meaning, because civilization seems no longer provide it. D.H. Lawrence is famous for this. His book gets banned in Britain from the 1960s. His Lady Chatterley's Lover, because it depicts certain sexual acts, stuff like this. but a sense of, the disillusionment, but also the anxiousness about life in this, world where we seem to be able to destroy ourselves now, and this sense of disillusion, even at the level of language. Again, James Joyce, a famous figure who was writing well before World War One. His novel Ulysses is published in 1922. It's also banned in other places. But Finnegan's Wake is a sort of at the level of language, this sort of, again, trying to reject the English language. He's Irish, so he's, reject the sort of colonial voice or whatever. It's published in fragments in various different journals till it's published as a whole. And it's meant to make a mockery of the conventions of language and to undermine the tradition in which he was working. So you have all these, alternative sources of meaning, because there is this sense that there is none. Again, you got that from Remarque in his work, and this comes out clearly even right after World War One, in visual arts, the so-called Dadaist movement. There's a manifesto in 1919 issued by a group of artists and writers, which is literally a protest against everything. They named it Dada. Dada is a nonsense word. It means hobby horse in French. And literally everything is nonsense. Everything is literature, art, morality, civilization. Life is vain, thought is vain, action is vain, everything is vain. It is a sort of pure, expression of post-war bitterness and disillusionment. And then one last thing I'll mention here is you're going to have surrealists painting in the 1930s. Surrealism will borrow from Freud, Carl Jung, and again, this turn toward the subjective as a release from the tyranny of the rational becomes sort of prominent in this period, and suggesting that rationality needs to be thrown off in the service of this subjective aspect of human nature. So there is this just a revolt against things, which you'll see, and again, looking for alternatives which seem to be extreme, and that's where you're gonna get the turn toward these dangerous ideologies in communism and fascism. Which brings us finally to the Russian Revolution and the USSR. So we have to sort of backtrack a little bit here and talk about this. Now, go back to 1917 and or before 1917, let's say. So there had been socialist parties in Europe after in the late 19th century. I need to explain this. The terminology is kind of important for a reason I'll explain in a moment. The term communism had basically disappeared by the late 1870s. Most parties didn't call themselves communist, even though they have fairly different goals, fairly similar goals, but the language of social democracy, socialism was the language of things. What brings it back is the Russian Revolution, the language of communism. And the person who's responsible for this, and this is very important, is Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, or calls himself Vladimir Lenin later on, takes that name, who was came from an upper middle class family. His father and parents were intellectuals. They were also revolutionaries. His brother was hanged for the conspiracy to assassinate Alexander III in the 1880s. So he came to despise Russia and run the Russian government. Very early on, wants to become a revolutionary. And the thing about Lenin is that, and he gets kicked out of university because he's too radical. He's going to protest and stuff like this. But as a thinker, he's the one that transforms communism into this, force that will take over Russia. And a couple things about this. You recall Marx's theory that it would be among the proletariat who, take over and establish the communist state. Most people in Russia were skeptical of that Marxism could actually be applied in Russia. Why? Because it has that gigantic peasantry, it has a tiny proletariat. There's only a tiny working class. Most people thought it couldn't be done there. But Vladimir Lenin took an idea from a Russian thinker named Plekhanov that it should succeed in Russia. But instead of having one massive proletarian revolution, you need to have two. needed to have a capitalist revolution, which the bourgeois would overthrow the czarist regime, and then a second one where they would the proletariat would be created, rise up, and they would overthrow the bourgeoisie. And the two big things that he's responsible for and helps create this Russian party called the Bolsheviks, we'll get to in a second, is that he contributes two ideas. One is that he has this idea of the vanguard of the proletariat. This is the idea that the proletariat alone is going to make this revolution. There can't be any compromise with the bourgeoisie. And in particular, he thinks this should proceed not as a mass movement, but as a sort of cadre of this is what he means by vanguard. He means it has to succeed by the talents of a tiny minority who are disciplined, radical, and totally dedicated by any means to overthrowing a capitalist society, which, by the way, means violence. He is quite clear this means killing lots of people. And that's what he means by vanguard. It means that they have to do that first, and that it has to go that way. And that's very important about his thinking, because he will succeed, as you'll see. The second thing is this revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat, about how it has to be a dictatorship. As you're going to see, it's the vanguard running this thing and not the masses. But also the other thing is he's the one who, again, brings back communism. Why? Because he will make the claim that socialism, because he's part of a socialist party, we'll get into in a moment, that socialism can only succeed in a Marxist form. All other forms are wrong, and they will be just as ruthless and vicious in destroying their enemies on the left as they will be on the right. But he will form this party in 1903 because he's part of this Russian Socialist Party, and he will break because he's a tiny minority. He expects this and accepts this. He wants to have this, there's this difference of opinions. You have people in the Socialist Party who want to work through current institutions to get what they want. He wants violent revolution, and he breaks away, and he actually gives his party the name Bolshevik. Bolshevik means majority, which of course is the opposite of what they were. In fact, they've given the name to their opponents, the majority, Menshevik, which means minority. As you're going to see here, basically, is that Lenin has this uncompromising idea that this lone cadre is totally right about history, totally right about where the world's going. You'll see this, by the way, reflected in Darkness at Noon if you haven't already read it. And this certainty about history and the sort of ends justifies the means morality is the source of a lot of their violence. But it doesn't go anywhere for several years because there's a revolution in 1905 in Russia. They lose a war, a naval war to Japan. And as a result, the Tsar Nicholas II is forced to create a Duma, a legislature, which he does, and make some grudging reforms, which for the most part mollifies the biggest criticisms among the intelligentsia of the government in Russia. And the party itself is only created in 1912 on the eve of formally created on the eve of World War I. And so he is the major force behind this. He, by the way, will spend most of his life in exile from the early 1900s because the Tsarist government runs him out of there. He'll come back, as you'll see, during the war. Look at this here. This is Vladimir Lenin here speaking to the masses, presumably, probably Petrograd, be Leningrad later on, named after his honor. But that's him. That's the man there with his, goatee and mustache. What gives him his chance was the war. What gives communism its chance is the war. And he'd been predicting, by the way, there would be a cataclysmic war because of, capitalism. It's inevitable. And the war itself goes badly for Russia. They lose major battles. I've already mentioned this during the war. What happens is there's going to be a revolution in 1917, February of that year, a revolution which will overthrow the Tsar, or sort of overthrow the Tsar, but it's a liberal revolution. It'll come under the control of a man named Alexander Kerensky. And you'll have this liberal government sort of go on fighting the war. That's one of its big downfalls. It'll fight the war. They'll keep doing badly. At the same time, in Petrograd in 1917, you're going to have the creation of the first so-called workers' Soviets. And these are really important. These are basically workers' sort of councils who will come to basically take over the governments in most of the major cities throughout Russia by the end of 1917. I mention this because what's going to happen is the Bolsheviks, his party, wondering how this tiny minority takes over. At first, he comes back. First of all, he's sent back by the German government. They know he's been. By the way, he's alone among the socialist parties of Europe, declaring that this is an imperialist war. We want nothing to do with it. He's pledged that if he gets into power, he's going to get Russia out of the war. So they sent him there. And what happens is eventually you're going to have this. You're going to have attempts at counter coups among Kerensky, the liberals, and the military. And it makes both of them very unpopular. The Bolsheviks, who by the time you get the latter part of the year, 1917, have seized power, have gained dominance within the Soviets. And by the way, Lenin had no intention of actually sharing power with these worker Soviets, but he adopted the slogan "all power to the Soviets" throughout that year in order to get them on his side. And so they seized control of the government on October 24th. This is the October Revolution of 1917. And by the end of November, the Soviets are in control of most of the actual apparatus of government. Lenin dissolves the legislature. There's supposed to be elections, by the way, for a legislative assembly have been formed in the initial revolution. He disbands it. The Bolsheviks have no intention of sharing power with anyone. And in fact, by 1918, they're in a position where they start actually either just outright murdering or prisoning political enemies. So you have this regime beginning to take over and beginning to eliminate systematically its opponents as a result of all this. He also, in March of 1918, goes to the negotiating table with Germany and signs the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And what happens here is that he has to, because they're in such a weak position, cede territory to Germany. And so you're going to have this getting out of the war, which is going to lead to almost inevitably a clash between the Bolsheviks and all of their opponents. This is the division between Red and White Russia. The Red Army is effectively created by Leon Trotsky, an intellectual. It's one of Lenin's collaborators. He apparently, it turns out this little pencil neck intellectual is actually a military genius because he creates the machine that'll become this, powerful army. And for the better part of a few years, they fight what are called the White Russians. The White Russian army is made up of a collection of people, actually. Imperialists, people who are loyal to the Tsar, other military officers who just couldn't stand the Bolsheviks. There are also people from the socialist parties, which the Bolsheviks were trying to destroy, were on side of the White Russians, called White Russia. There are two major invasions by the White Russians, one from the east, which the Red Army managed to defeat, a much more serious one from the south, which the White Russian general gets close to Moscow but doesn't have the resources to go all the way, and is eventually defeated by 1920. By the way, the White Russians are supported by the Allies in World War I, including the United States. There are troops in Russia by the end of the war. They are terrified of a communist government. If you're wondering why, we'll get to this in a moment. One of Lenin's ideas is that this is not supposed to be a Russian-only thing. It's supposed to start in Russia. It's supposed to spread to the entire world. They literally want to create a civil war on a global scale between proletariat and the capitalist world order. They are all, but however, in the West, they suffer a defeat. Does the Bolsheviks by Poland? Poland has been an independent country. They fight a battle. Battle of Warsaw. They defeat them on it's sometimes called the Miracle of the Vistula, because they stop the Soviet advance into Western Europe. They sign a peace treaty. It's a humiliating defeat for them, actually. At the same time, they also put down independence movements in the Baltic. This is Lithuania, Latvia, those places, but also the Ukraine. Ukraine tried to establish their own republic. They're defeated by the Soviets. And in Central Asia, where some of the Muslim-dominated areas rise up against them, they're also defeated by the early 1920s. So you have this massive revolution, and I'll show you in a moment. Russia is a massive country, so we're talking about massive amounts of people, massive amounts of killing. By the end of the Civil War, about 7 to 8 million people are probably dead as a result of it. So lots of mass, the war itself creates a civil war, which creates this massive wave of destruction. And see here, this is the Polish War, just to talk where they're fighting with Russia and where they're fighting over, again, this is Minsk, this is Belarus, this is Lithuania, fighting over parts of these things here. Will become a modern Ukraine. As you'll see, at one point, the Red Army actually will push it way far into Poland. They'll eventually push them back, as you'll see, by 1922, and push into modern-day Ukraine and Belarus. But this is what Russia looks like about 1936, or at least the Soviet Union. You can kind of see here. This is the Republic of Russia. Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, right? It's based on this idea, which of the Soviets, and by the time you get to they gain power, the Soviets have been broken totally. The actual workers' councils, White Russia up here, the Ukraine, these are the Central European. This is the Caucasus, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Siberia over here, and right to the Pacific over here. So it's a massive, massive empire that the Soviets basically inherit in some ways from their predecessors. Now, with the victory over the whites, they begin to consolidate their regime. The International is the International Meeting of Communist Leaders, which Lenin had wanted to convoke a third one. They'd had a second one. He thought, again, make his leadership clear of the international movement, which he does. He holds this meeting in 1920. He lays down ground rules for exporting the revolution. This is one of the things that frightens the hell out of Western allies. Their goal is to subvert and destroy capitalist countries. At the same time, they make a move against, they begin imposing things like censorship and on writers and literary thinkers, anything against the party, basically. Again, you're familiar with the term Pravda, was the name of the Bolshevik newspaper, which existed before, 1912, actually, I think, is when it was actually created. So, which is the visual party line, all those are the sorts of things they begin to take. And this is the thing about Soviet Union and the Nazi state, is they have a drive to control everything in society. And what's the one of the things they do? They also try to do this to religion, by the way. They've attacked most of the religions in the country. They still, not until 1920, 1918, I don't have it in my notes, but 1918 haven't had a chance to get to attack the Orthodox Church, which they do. They begin despoiling churches, digging up the bones of martyrs and scattering them, they're trying to destroy people's faith. This doesn't work. They ban Christmas, they ban religious celebrations. In the end, what they wind up doing is creating a state church, which is controlled by the Communist Party for means of controlling people of the Orthodox faith in that country, and persecuting them pretty heavily as well. At the same time, they have to deal with a famine because the economy during the war tanks, and this actually leads to a rebellion of peasants at Kronstadt's, a naval installation, which actually is where the revolution began in 1917. The Bolshevik Revolution began in 1917. They have to put this down pretty brutally. But all this unrest leads to a recognition on the part of Lenin and his advisors that they need to do something. And one thing to do is they crack down on dissent. I mentioned that already. But they also institute what he calls the new economic policy. And the new economic policy is basically going back to a market economy in a limited way. They need to make money. They need to produce food to feed everyone. And so they allow the peasantry to have land again. The whole idea, of course, was to get rid of property. They do this, and actually by 1928, when the program was discontinued, they've actually boosted production to above pre-war levels. So it worked. And in fact, by the time of his death, in fact, he's by 1921, he's already beginning to get seriously ill. He'll kind of lose control because of this, because of his health. But Lenin's become disillusioned by the end of his life. On All the things he thought was going to happen as a result of the revolution more or less haven't happened. There's some thought he might have continued that new economic policy indefinitely. We don't know, because as he was dying, there was a struggle for power. And this is what brings Joseph Stalin to power. Stalin's, of course, a name he takes, which means, I think his name is, I can't remember his actual name. Don't have it in my notes for some reason. It's like Sakishvili, but he's a Georgian by birth. He's not actually born to a poor Georgian family. Like Lenin, he's expelled not from university but from the seminary in 1899. Eventually joined the Bolsheviks. Joins Lenin in 1903, and he'll be the first editor of Pravda in 1912. Gets exiled to Siberia. So like Lenin, he is in exile prior to World War I. The war brings him back. And he will spend most of the war. He's not really that important, actually, before the war. It's actually after the war he becomes really important in terms of, if you don't know, he had been someone who was kind of a thug in a lot of ways, kind of someone who was did things like rob banks, try to sort of fund the party while it was in exile. In any case, he becomes chairman of the Communist Party in 1922. And I mention all this because he is effectively what makes Stalin an effective, why he maneuvers into power, is that he's basically a bureaucrat. He's a good organizer. He's a hard worker. He knows how to do paperwork. And in fact, what happens is one of the reasons why he able to maneuver himself in a position to take over for Lenin, because most people thought Leon Trotsky, who was the more charismatic, more intellectual of the two. And Stalin, by the way, was an intellectual. He read fairly widely and everything else. But he was the one willing to do the dirty work of actually creating a bureaucratic system by which they would control the country. And again, one of the things to note about Stalinism and about Soviet Union in the 1930s, they came to power as a tiny minority. And so this probably reflected this ideology of Lenin that, they were a vanguard of they were a vanguard of history, right? So they have to rule and have power. And what happens is, soon after his death, he begins slowly ousting his rivals in the party. And by 1928 and 29, has effectively taken over. He gets Trotsky exiled. Eventually, he'll have him killed in Mexico City. And so, basically, through his building up of a power base in the bureaucracy, people loyal to him, into the secret police, he managed to eliminate most of his rivals and come to authority that way. But he's effectively a sort of manager and organizer. He's a fixer and a bureaucrat, ultimately. This is a picture of Joseph Stalin here, as you can see, probably from the 1930s and 40s. What he looks like, his military garb. And so when he comes to power, he decides that he ends the new economic policy in the 1920s. And he decides that the country, both for the sake of, I just should explain here, by this time, the Soviet Union is kind of a pariah state. Again, it's been informally recognized by most countries, not the United States, more than they do with it. But it's surrounded by what it takes to be hostile powers. He decides to put the international revolution on the backseat to make an experiment with what he calls socialism in one country, meaning try to develop the capabilities of the Soviet state. And one of the things he does is he basically begins a program of enforced industrialization. And what this does basically is that they have to get what it wants to do is take land from peasants, kulaks as they're called, in Russia and elsewhere, and force them into communal farms, force them to go into the factories and stuff like this. So long story short, these kulaks don't want to give up their land. So what basically he does is that, this is hard to explain, he goes around basically having the Red Army go and seize grain from these farmers, these peasants, and effectively starves them out. In particular, in 1932 and 1933, this is most famously in Ukraine. Literally, the Red Army surrounds Ukraine, goes into every village, every hamlet, takes every last bit of food away from there, and basically starves these peasants into submission. And millions die as a result. I mean, in Ukraine, it's called the Holodomor there. The low estimate, something like 1 to 2 million. The high estimate, somewhere between like 5 and 10 people starved to death as a result of all this. And if you know that starvation is a horrific way to die, I'll give you one story. This is from the Ukraine. There was someone told a story. I remember the people telling it, but they told a story about a neighbor they had that lived through this period. Had a young neighbor, was a young woman who was unmarried, had an infant child, and they went next door to check it. This is when there's no food around. People are killing themselves because starving to death is a horrible way to die. And they went next door to check on this woman, and they found she'd hanged herself, but they couldn't find her infant daughter. So they searched all over the house, every room, until they got to the kitchen. And they went in the kitchen and they found the oven was on. And they went and looked in the oven, and they found that the woman had actually killed and was going to cook her infant to eat. That's how horrific this stuff was. Because I'm giving you all these numbers, and the numbers are astronomical because that's just in the Ukraine. It might have been, the numbers are somewhere upwards in Russia itself of 10 to 20 million people were killed as a result of this man-made famine by Stalin, which, by the way, was covered up in the Western press. Famously, there was a New York Times correspondent in Moscow in 1932 named Walter Duranty, who basically, he knew the famine was going on, but he denied that it was going on in print. In fact, most of the Western correspondents didn't actually say anything about this, and the reason why is they were afraid of being kicked out by Stalin, not able to cover what was going on there. They actually made a film about this a few years ago. It's called Mr. Jones, because there were only 2 journalists who actually wrote about the famine at the time. One was a guy named Malcolm Muggeridge, who wrote under a pseudonym about what was going on, but only one journalist, was a Welsh guy named Gareth Jones, wrote articles in a British newspaper signing his actual name, stating what was going on. And so you have this horrific, drive, which, by the way, it works. It does turn the actual industrialization plan, does turn the Soviet Union into an industrial country by the end of the 1930s, but it comes at the horrific cost of doing all this. And then finally, just there is, of course, the Great Terror of 1937 to 1938. You have, in this period, a series of trials in which a lot of former high-ranking members of the Communist Party, men who have been with Stalin from the beginning, are either put on trial and then executed for crimes that in many instances they did not commit, or they are quietly done away with. There's a whole, and this, by the way, just to be noted here, by the way, if you're thinking about things like gulags, they already exist. There is a system of labor camps from the early 1920s of political prisoners and criminals in the Soviet Union from 1919 onward, and the gulags had a total population of about 100,000 people by the end of the 1920s, and then it went under a massive expansion because of Joseph Stalin's agricultural program, and so you had 3 waves of major pushing people into the gulags. First is 29th to 1932, the era of forced collectivization. Then 1936 to 1938, at the height of his purges, and then a third one after World War II. Figures compiled by the Gulag administration itself estimate about 10 million people were sent to camps. from 1934 to 1947. The dissident, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, put it at 50 million. But the Soviets didn't keep great records. We're not really sure how many millions of people were put in these camps, where, people in these camps, again, the total number from 1919 to about 1956 is about maybe 1 to 1.7 million people being killed. But you have this horrible system punctuated by this great terror where he purges all of these people. This is, by the way, what inspires Darkness at Noon. In particular, one show trial by a man named Nikolai Bukharin, who was a longtime associate of Stalin, who was seen to be a rival of his, was again an idealist, as you'll see, kind of like Koestler himself. It's put on trial and executed in 1938. This is actually in the introduction to your edition, if you have it. All this, by the way, shocks the world in 1937-38. You have all these communists being put on trial while it's going on. But it's clearly related to Stalin's, at this point, his paranoia about controlling a potential counter-revolution. That's one of the things about this. If you're wondering how you could go destroy peasantry, even though you're speaking in the name of the peasantry, well, now the peasants were in the way of the revolution. And by the way, the Soviets are very big on language, about manipulating language to do this. First of all, when you make the revolution, like you use phrases to dehumanize the bourgeoisie. They're pigs, they're swine, they're this, they're parasites. Well, the same thing is done with the kulak. The term kulak, by the way, is a negative term in, I believe, Russian. I don't know. It's meant to these disgusting, selfish parasites. And it's basically class warfare, but using the same sort of logic, by the way, the Nazis will use against Jews, dehumanizing with language. And it gets out of control because he has this massive state, has this massive police force, the NKVD, which can, of course, which is used to find and arrest dissidents throughout the Soviet Union. So all of this comes to a head in the 1930s. I've already gone over some of this, unfortunately, jumping ahead of myself. But you have this, and again, the NKVD practice something called mutual surveillance. Again, it basically undertook again things like what you'd think, right? Extrajudicial executions of citizens, deportations. They all oversaw Soviet protection of Soviet borders. And it's called mutual surveillance, by the way, because you have this, it becomes a system of getting people to sort of surveil on each other. You turn your neighbors in because you don't know if you don't, you'll be turned in. And it creates this just mass system of paranoia and suspicion, which poisons the country, by the way. To this day, there's a chronic endemic lack of trust in Russia. That is created by this. And again, it's held as well by the sort of cult of personality that Stalinism becomes in the 1930s. He basically, you've seen all the portraits of Stalin, the sort of worship of him by the masses there, which is redolent of the same sort of presentation you'll get in fascist dictatorships like Hitler and Stalin. But one of the weird things about this in Russia is that he's clearly playing on religious traditions of Russian Orthodoxy, right? The fathers are the father of the country. Even if you ever heard the Soviet, go listen to it. The Soviet national anthem. It's actually kind of nice in musical terms, but it clearly draws on the Russian choral tradition, Orthodox choral tradition. So there's this weird, cultification of Stalin himself, and of course there are material deprivations in this communist system under Stalin for obvious reasons. And one last thing I'll mention about this is class and gender, and class became an attribute of one's that defined one's relationship with the state. It gets put in one's passport along with their nationality, age, and sex. You do have it's an official policy of the Soviet Union to provide things like abortion and birth control to women. There is this idea of, again, women are supposed to be equal and all this other stuff. but it's again, it's in a under this general sort of rule of repression. It doesn't really. Again, you could say in that sense it's more free. You do have free healthcare and stuff like this, but it's only in the context of this horrific drive to reshape society. I should mention, by the way, all this is predicated on, in some way people still debate this, but Stalin. Some people argue about this. Was it just paranoia? Was it just he was crazy? And there's some reason to think, no, he's actually still carrying out Lenin's ideas. Remember, they had to have that second revolution, right, in order to have the proletariat take over. And so his forced industrialization campaign can kind of be seen as an extension of that. And from beginning to end, he describes himself as a Marxist. He describes himself as a socialist and a communist. And I think what happens if you're trying to explain all this is that this revolutionary ideology of an elite vanguard who has to go by violent force, reshape society, gets combined with this massive bureaucracy that he creates. It's almost, I think that's the thing that makes it the horrific regime it becomes in the 1930s. And I don't have numbers, by the way, on the gulags. Well, I did have numbers on the gulags, but the numbers of people, I don't have numbers of people who died in the purges. It has to be it's in the thousands, certainly, probably possibly the hundreds of thousands. So the numbers are just astronomical of the number of people have died in the 1930s. I might mention, by the way, a similar thing happens in the 1950s and 60s in China. So this is something that seems to be peculiar to communism, this ideology of forcing rapid change on a population. Although, again, we'll talk about this in discussion about this, but at least the revolutionary version of it, combined with a modern, powerful nation state, is a deadly thing. Which brings us finally to Darkness at Noon, the book you are reading. And by the way, this background picture from my slide is a picture of a show trial from Ukraine in the 1930s, just to let you know. Arthur Koestler, our author for this week, was born in Hungary, 1905, of Jewish ancestry. Brilliant in terms of his mathematical capabilities. Apparently, his parents send him to college to be an engineer, but he drops out. And he winds up, and he's the kind of guy who is very obsessive in ways, winds up becoming a Zionist and moving to Palestine. Actually spends a brief amount of time on a kibbutz in Israel, what would become Israel in Palestine at the time, and doesn't work very well there because he's too, kibbutz is a sort of small-scale utopian form of communism, but he can't have the repression of his personality like that. He's too individualistic. And so you have here, what happens is he gets a job with a German newspaper in Israel and becomes a journalist, and will cover various events in the Holy Land and elsewhere. But he will also briefly shortly thereafter become a communist, and then eventually lose his position because of that with the German newspaper. But makes his name as a journalist first. Then starts writing propaganda for the Communist International. Remember it's called the Comintern, but begins writing propaganda for them. It's very idealistic. Eventually goes to report on the war in Spain, the Spanish Civil War, which starts in 1936. I'll talk a little bit about this when I talk about fascism next time. And on the Soviet side, gets captured, spends several months by the nationalists, I guess you should say, in Spain, and this experience begins to reshape his thinking. But really does begin to reshape his thinking is that he comes back, and again, I mentioned before, he sees, as everyone else, these show trials that begin to happen in the late 1930s in the Soviet Union, and that's what sort of leads him to begin to drift away from this, leave communism, and write this book in 1940, which it doesn't sell very well at the beginning. In 1940, during the war, as soon as the war ends, he becomes a celebrity, and he is for a few years one of the most famous writers in the world. He'll write several other novels. He'll stop in the 1950s, begins writing other stuff. I'll get to this in a moment, but eventually will contract Parkinson's disease at the end of his life, and makes a suicide pact. His wife also has Parkinson's disease. I think it's the second or third wife, and will commit suicide in 1983 as a result of all this. And a couple of things about, well, this is, by the way, this is a picture of Arthur Koestler. I don't know what year this is from, but that's him, the man himself. And I think I may have messed up my slide here. Well, I didn't actually. So a couple of things about him. One is that he's kind of a good figure for this well, we're talking about here, comes of age during World War I, doesn't fight in World War I. But like a lot of people, he was searching for meaning in the aftermath of this, as you can kind of see, going from being a Zionist to a communist. And like a lot of people, and this is the thing to note, they're seeking an alternative to Western liberalism in some form or another. And he looks to his whole life for this. This is to explain why people get attracted to Soviet communism, why they get attracted to Nazism or Mussolini's fascism. Because again, there are people today having questions about the future of liberalism. This is a thing people talk about. I guess it's mostly on the right, but still, there is this seeking an alternative to it. And his career is kind of anticlimactic because it's basically all downhill from his celebrity after World War II. He spends the rest of his career writing nonfiction works. He got into Indian mysticism in a big way. He wrote a really weird book arguing that, I think it's called The 13th Tribe, arguing that the Jewish people were not a separate ethnicity, but they were descended from a people called the Khazars in Central Asia. Very strange stuff. It kind of, his reputation kind of declined. And I must say, I did not know this until I was doing research for the lecture. One of the reasons that his reputation declined is that, well, first of all, the Cold War ended, and so he's less relevant in that way. The other reason is that in 1988, a man named David Cesarini wrote a biography of him, which revealed some things about his sexual life that kind of shocked people, which if they'd been revealed in the last few years would have got him totally canceled, but I guess he's already been canceled anyway. He had, I guess I should be honest about this. I don't want to frighten anybody or disturb them, but apparently he had it's kind of hard to say this, but he apparently had a fetish for I can't even call it rough sex. He actually uses the word and talks about it in his private letters and his diaries. He had, I guess you call it, a rape fetish. And no, I'm being literal. He apparently liked forcing women to have sex with him. I mentioned this, by the way, because this is disturbing. If you read the book already, when you do read it, there's the main character, Rubashov, in the book, where he kind of forces himself on a woman. That's apparently from experience. What's more disturbing is that apparently he did this to multiple women. A lot of them apparently, he retained friendships with them afterwards. So this is someone, by the way, if you were alive today, would be totally put in prison probably. So 1995, I'm doing this for honesty's sake. I hope it doesn't offend. I hope it doesn't ruin. I don't want to be triggered by this, is my point. I did not know this when I signed the book. But he had to say the least, questionable personal life in that regard. However, the book itself is is a great work. It really is a great book. It's based partly on his experience in the Spanish Civil War, but also, of course, on Buchanan, this person he admired, being imprisoned and then executed for crimes he didn't commit. The main character in the book is a man named Rubashov, who is, again, it's pretty transparently supposed to be someone who was, comrade of Stalin, who gets arrested for these ridiculous crimes that he's supposed to have committed, but then over the course of the book winds up confessing them. And one of the reasons he writes this book is one of the things that shocked people outside of, and again, it shocked, by the way, the revolutionary, the communist, the socialist left. People like another author I could have assigned, George Orwell, right? This is one of the things that disillusions them with the Soviet experiment. I mentioned there are a lot of admirers in the West. And the reason why is they were obviously, why would you do this to someone who had been part of the old guard and part of the original revolutionary movement? Moreover, why did he confess to the crimes? He was obviously innocent of them. And part of the nature of the book is to explain why a person would do that. As you're going to see, I won't give it away. Rubashov has his reasons for doing it, but it also has him wrestling with what he's done, because as you'll see, he's in some ways an awful figure. He also has good qualities, but you'll see a lot of what Koestler reveals about revolutionary thinking of the Soviets. Like literally, there'll be slogans in there like "the party is always right." That was an actual slogan. Communists, and later on, I think in China too, but definitely in Soviet Russia, the party literally could not err. Why? Because again, they're the vanguard of history. They're on the right side of history. We are always right. The party is always right. If something goes wrong, if somebody sees something wrong with the party, it must be something wrong with them. It's sort of given this sort of infallibility, which Rubashov comes to question. And so that's one of the things we'll want to talk about in the actual book, and talk about what this says about, this revolutionary ideology of not just Soviet communism, but how much that is part of the modern mindset. That for modernity is this, force which we have to sort of go along with because we're on the right side of history and we have to do all this stuff. And you can kind of see some of this working out in the novel itself, and you'll see some of these slogans repeated in the novel. And you can also see, I can already see I've seen some connections with some of the stuff we've read directly, as you'll see. So, and that is it. That is the lecture, a little preparation for Darkness at Noon. I hope have a good discussion. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. That is all. So take care, and I will see you guys on Tuesday, and we'll see what you make of it. Take care.